Diana. I will be your moderator tonight, pronouns she, her. Today we're talking about upholding the right for Palestinians to continue on their land and to stay alive in the conflict with Israel that is ongoing at this moment. We understand that this is a sensitive issue that is directly impacting many of the people in our communities, and as such we seek to ensure that today the event is carried out with empathy and due care. So please be respectful and care for one another. We want to stress that all human life is valuable without hierarchy or exception, and we grieve for all civilians lost in the course of this ongoing conflict. There will be no tolerance for Islamophobia or anti-Semitism of any kind as we move forward with our discussion. Any discrimination, disruption, or disrespect will result in security asking you to leave. Today we are joined by a safety team, and you will see them in high-vis vests around the room. I don't know if they're in yet because they're still letting people in at the door. But these are de-escalators, and they will basically help with anyone who's feeling escalated or overwhelmed by the conversation. We can escort you to student supports on the landing near the snacks. And we also are handing out leaflets of campus supports that you can turn to anytime following this event. And to ensure this event proceeds without a hitch, we have taken student questions prior. And so these will be incorporated into our discussion. And finally, we want to advise that audio of this event will be recorded, and we are also live streaming. And so any disruption will be recorded. And yeah, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here, who I will introduce shortly. But before that, some of the Indigenous law students have written a land acknowledgement that I'm going to read for you today. Thank you for your solidarity and for having us here as settlers. In their original form, territorial acknowledgements were viewed as a means to educate and build relationships with settlers in spaces that have traditionally contributed to erasure of Indigenous voices. Today, we are responding to that call for recognition and relationship building by recognizing that most of us are settlers in this space, gathering on unceded and unsurrendered territory. I'd like to acknowledge that we are currently gathered today on the lands of the Coloniality people, known as the Esquimalt and Songhees nations, and acknowledge those Sanish nations who also have a relationship to this land. We want to acknowledge that the history of settler colonialism here in Turtle Island is an ongoing process of erasure and removal of Indigenous peoples from their territories and families through forced displacement, assimilation, and dispossession through countless institutionalized tactics from the settler state. One of the main purposes of settler colonialism is to make Indigenous peoples invisible. An important example of the shared history between Turtle Island and Palestine is the struggle to continue existing. As settlers in the global north, we want to stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples globally. While it is easier to deny Indigenous peoples their rights if we would historicize their struggles, Indigenous peoples continue to endure the hardest consequences of settler colonialism, making the struggles of Indigenous peoples deeply intertwined from Turtle Island to Palestine. The lack of financial commitment from the Canadian government to materialize the TRC calls to actions while actively funding and supporting genocide, not only at home, but also in Palestine, serves as a stark reminder of the shared history and ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples globally. Standing in solidarity with Indigenous peoples reaches across continents, requiring us to be united for justice, self-determination, decolonization, and the preservation of their cultures and land. Thank you so much for having us today on this sacred land. On that note, thank you so much to the students who crafted that beautiful land acknowledgement, and I want to turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves in a way that feels good to them. Michael, I'm going to start off with you.
Okay. It's great to see everybody up there. It's a little bit intimidating looking at a wall of faces up there. I hope you're all doing good. Can you hear me okay at this level? So I'm a sessional instructor with political science, and I've been teaching on and off there for several years. I'm currently teaching for the third fall in a row the department's second year Introduction to International Politics. My research specialization is Middle East politics and Palestinian struggle. I've taught these subjects in numerous courses going back several years. I've published on these topics. I did my dissertation on Palestinian struggle, and I spent 6 months in the occupied West Bank doing research and human rights work. I'm here because I was invited, and I hope that I can make some small contribution. Thank you for coming.
Hi everyone, my name is Omar. I go with Omar Mansour. I'm a Palestinian Canadian, and I came here to Canada in 2015 after the last Israeli aggression on the Gaza Strip in 2014. That was 56 days war. I witnessed the 3 wars. I stopped counting because there are too many of them. I witnessed 2008, 2011, and 2014. I was located in the northern Gaza Strip. And I finished my graduate degree here from UVic, from Gustafson School of Business. I've been a student here for 3 years, and now I'm just working in the publishing industry. At this moment, my family and everybody I know is under bombardment in the northern the Gaza Strip. Just to let you know, I'm live streaming this just so any friends or relatives or anyone can know that their voices, and if their voices are heard, some people are actually hearing their voices and are standing for them. And I'm looking forward to have a decent discussion with all of you. Thank you.
Hello friends, hello everybody out there. Darcy Lindbergh, my family is the late Bev Fraser, the late Brian Lindbergh. I come from the Musqueam Chiefs Cree and the Battleford area as well. And grateful to be here. I'm an associate assistant. I'm a professor at the University of Victoria. What am I, Freya? Assistant professor, and I teach in the Faculty of Law. And grateful for the invitation to be here to offer whatever bit of truth I can offer to this panel as well. Grateful that you've all joined us. Grateful you're here, Omar. Hi.
Hi everyone, I'm Asad Kiani. I'm an associate professor in law at the faculty here at the University of Victoria. I teach public international law, I've taught international criminal law, I've taught immigration and refugee law, and I research in all of those areas as well as domestic criminal law. I'm here to speak primarily about international law and where it is and how it might operate in the context of this conflict. I did my research as a PhD student on international criminal law, that's where I primarily published. And I'm hoping to speak more to where that law is. I'm grateful for the invitation, as the others have noted. I'm very honored to be here, and I'm very grateful that you're all here as well.
We're sharing one microphone, so please be patient. To start off, we do want to ground our discussion in the lived experience of Palestinians in Gaza, and Omar has been gracious enough to agree to discuss some of his family's history in historic Palestine. And so if we could all be very respectful, give space, and send power in this moment.
Just put this here, and then we'll just pass it. Yeah. Hi everyone. So I'll just give a briefing about what's happening at this moment. As you can see, we're all watching the news. Of course, if you're watching the Western media, you're not getting the right news. If you're watching TikTok and X, maybe you are getting something. At this moment, what is happening and what's been happening is from day one, when this happened, we knew that there's going to be this whole case and this whole issue will be used to commit as much as possible of killing on the Palestinians. So we went to the streets to demand one thing and one thing only, which was a ceasefire. At that moment, we've been called by the Canadian government and many people as Hamas, pro-Hamas, or pro-terrorism. For me, about my background, I've been living in the Gaza Strip since 1997 until 2013. During that time, I witnessed that the starting of the siege of the Gaza Strip in 2006, that illegal siege that was made by the Israeli government on the Gaza Strip. I've been locked in an open-air prison until I got the chance to sneak out from the Gaza Strip in 2014, coming here to Canada to study. I am not a member of Hamas, just so people who use this. If I was, I would say, but I'm not a member of Hamas. I'm not here representing any Palestinian organization. I'm here representing myself as an educated Palestinian. And I'm not asking for sympathy or empathy from anyone. I'm here to represent people as the survivors who are looking at you in the Western world as a leading people of civilization and human rights and legal aspects. I'm here to represent my people and represent the situation there, asking every single one of you to take action. Of course, you can't take action unless you educate yourself as much as possible, and that's why I'm here to answer any of your questions. During my time living in the Gaza Strip, again, I witnessed 2008, 2011, 2014. But one of the main things that I noticed in any of these escalations and aggressions from the Israeli government is no matter what the level of escalation happened, the main idea, the main thing that you see is mass destruction. I live in the north of the Gaza Strip, so my question is always, if you have an issue with someone, if you have a problem with any Palestinian organization, why would you, for example, wipe up a whole farm, for example, or factories? Why would you, for example, pump our power station? In 2008 or 2007, if you remember, some Hamas members kidnapped an Israeli soldier called Gilad Shalit. I think it was in 2002, 2003. At that time, I remember the first thing happened by Israeli military is they pumped our power station, our only power station in the Gaza Strip. You know what that resulted? Living until 2014 in 4 hours only electricity a day. So I finished my bachelor's, master's, only living on 4 hours of electricity. And the question here is, if you have an issue or if there's an escalation happening, why would you destroy an infrastructure for all the people? But again, 2007 happens and Hamas wins the election. What happens is there is an illegal punishment of all Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. No one can get in, no one get out. At this very moment, the last time I was able to communicate with my family was 48 hours ago. It's another collective punishment of people who are living in the Gaza Strip as civilians, that 2.2 million people are unable to communicate with their loved ones by any means. What I've been noticing every single aggression is the collective punishment of every single Palestinian, as if we're just numbers of people who, whatever happens, nobody cares, or whatever happens to us, we are always paying the price for anything. Again, coming here and working in the publishing industry and reading the news, basically Canadian news, like CTV, CBC, and watching and hearing a line of saying 20 Palestinian died. And I was asking myself, like, they just died? They just, like, they were living in the La La Land and they decided to die. That's maybe it. And also, at the same line, you will see 20 Palestinians or 200 Palestinians or 1,000 Palestinians died, 500 or 100 Israeli or one Israeli killed at the same time. So working and studying and understanding the Canadian culture and living here for 10 years, I am still trying to understand the reasoning behind the dehumanization of the West of my people. But at the same time, as someone who comes here and educate myself about indigenous, absolutely, you can't come here and not educate yourself about the indigenous cause and the history of Canada. You would understand that this has been systemically happening since long time. And that's basically what's happening on the Palestinians for so many years. At this moment, there isn't much I can really talk about of of the suffering of the people. You've been watching the news. I'm not here to tell you the news, but I can give you some numbers of how many hospitals being bombed. 2 hours ago, Al-Shifa Hospital, around the Shifa Hospital was getting bombed. 2 hospitals went out of service. The Indonesian Palestinian hospital in the north of Gaza Strip, and Al-Quds Hospital in central Gaza Strip. That's basically what I can do, what I can say for now. But please, what I want you to do is to ask as many questions as you can, and I will be able to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omar. I also wonder, Michael, if you could elaborate a bit on the blockade. Like Omar discussed not being able to go in and out. Some of us might not be as familiar with what is happening what even is a blockade, how it has been enforced, and what that means for people moving in and out of Gaza or getting goods in Gaza.
Right. So as Omar said, in 2006, Palestinians had elections. And they voted Hamas into power of the Palestinian Authority. It was Palestinian Authority elections, and the Palestinian Authority is the governing body in the occupied territories. The Palestinian Authority is really not much of an authority at all because it effectively has the powers of a municipal government. The authorities have to call the Israeli occupation authorities if they want to move from one town to another. So nonetheless, limited though the authority is, Hamas was elected in 2006. And what that signified, I think, was the Palestinian population being very tired of the failures of the diplomatic efforts of the PLO or the PA under Yasser Arafat and then Mahmoud Abbas, who strived for years to achieve a two-state solution going back to the late 1980s and were rejected and rebuffed at every turn. There's a lot of myth and propaganda about there being no negotiating power, but you could hardly imagine a more pliable and obedient ruling class as the Palestinian Authority has been that the PLO morphed into, and particularly under the Fatah Party. So the mainstream Palestinian Party pursued peace for decades, and conditions got worse and worse on the ground, and in 2006, Hamas is elected to govern the authority. However, the West, the U.S., and Israel did not accept the results of that election and implemented a coup to try and overthrow the Hamas group and install or preserve the rule of Mahmoud Abbas despite losing the election. And when Hamas fought back, the blockade was instituted, and it effectively, Israel, the whole land between the river and the sea, is a very small place, but the Gaza Strip is just a tiny thumbnail of that small territory. And it's been, the Israelis have imposed a blockade by sea, by air, by land crossing, controlling the entry ports, who goes in, who goes out, literally for years counting the calories that are going in to keep the population on a diet, as Israelis have put it. And another euphemism that the Israelis have used to describe their policy of the Gaza blockade is periodic mowing of the lawn, which means the weeds get a little bit too high. We've got to go and knock it down with a lot of airstrikes in the fashion that Omar described, and these tend to happen every few years. I don't know what else to say. Israel, it's not the case that the occupation ended. The troops inside the Gaza Strip were redeployed to the perimeter. But when the whole place is on lockdown and Israel continues, they can turn the electricity off, they can turn the water off, they can turn all the communications off. This is one of the most controlled, surveilled, and obstructed. No freedom of movement for the people living there. They cannot leave. It's not that they want to leave Gaza or Palestine, but they want the right to be able to travel, to move if they want. But the majority of people in the Gaza Strip have never set foot outside of that tiny thumbnail of land because it's an incredibly young population. Of the 2.2 million people, something like 1 million of them are children, and many of the militants who broke out of the Gaza Strip on October 7th were had tasted freedom or seen beyond the wall and the gates and the fences for the first time in their lives. Yeah.
Thank you. So we've all heard about October 7th and the aftermath. One thing I do want to do is contextualize what happened there and discuss the modes of peaceful resistance that Palestinians have employed prior to what is a violent and criminal attack. But what has been going on prior to this attack that leads up to this kind of struggle? Omar, do you have any point on that?
I mean, I have a brother who is 21, 22 years old. He was born in 2000s, and in 2000 there was the second Intifada. At least for me, I was born in 1990, so at least I saw the world before coming to Palestine. I was living with my family when I was a kid in Saudi Arabia and Jordan, Lebanon, these areas. But so I've seen a glimpse of what the world is like. But for someone like my brother Firas, who is a very nice, intellectual, smart programmer, who have never seen what is the world is like, living since he was a kid under siege. When he was 7 or 6, there was a siege. So this guy grew up seeing nothing but escalations and more bombing. And on daily basis, we're not only talking about 2008 aggression, it's like, oh, there's one day of aggression. We're talking about daily live aggression. For us had to live, and I had to live with 4 hours electricity. So he had to think every single moment, oh, we don't have enough water, oh, we don't have enough food. So it's every single day in his brain is a survival day. Every day by day, since you're a kid, you're thinking of how you're going to survive tomorrow. But that's not enough. You're questioning, like I told Zaki, for us, here's the internet. And then you started seeing the internet, how is the world is living. Then Netflix started coming and popping up. It's like, oh, there's these kind of stuff exist. He have never been to an airplane. His dream is to be an airplane. But his dream also is to meet anyone from outside the Gaza Strip. He doesn't know what people outside the Gaza Strip look like. It's kind of like people there are feeling like anybody else outside is an alien, with zero interaction with anyone. At least when I was working for this non-profit organization. So I got the chance to travel by air crossing. Only like 0.001% of people get this kind of permit by the Israeli government for to work with for like a training in the U.S. So I was able to meet people, and he was sitting there with me every single day, listening of what people outside the Gaza Strip look like, living every single day under pressure and questioning why everyone else in the world have the right to do anything and see everything, but he doesn't have the right to do so. And then yesterday, or a week ago, I'm hearing this Canadian general saying on a radio station that, oh yeah, 60% of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are children, but most of them got radicalized by Hamas. And I was like, whew. So for us, it's one of those people who are radicalized by Hamas. And my question to any of you, if you live every single day since a kid and you're seeing nothing but violence every single day, and my brother is not a member of Hamas anyway, none of us, what would your life or thinking would look like if you are in the corner and for 17 years you're getting nothing but people are hitting you and slapping you every single day? What would be your reaction? That's not only a daily life. You're talking about, according to the UN research, it's an inhabitable place. No clean water, no clean air, there no enough space. You're talking about 2.3 million people in the size, I heard, of Montreal. Imagine. It's absolutely a cage. It's fully a cage. No water, no enough education. Every single day, 24/7, you're hearing the drones 24/7 in your head. So you're sleeping, and while you're sleeping, you're hearing the beeping of a drone 24/7. That's the torture. When I read about one of the World War I or II ways of torturing prisoners, it was making this noise while they were in prison. It's the same situation. You are surveillance everywhere. If you want to go to the beach, you will see warships in front of you. If you are around our farm in the northern of the Gaza Strip, There are automated guns near the buffer zone. So if you cross or if you walk 1.5 kilometers behind the apartheid wall, you're shot by default. So I just want you to imagine you as Firas, my brother, and question yourself, what would you do in this case?
Thank you. I was wondering if you could also discuss the 2018.
Sure. So I think the question has to do with Palestinian traditions of resistance, which is kind of what I focus on a lot in my research and writing. And liberation struggles involve resistance. The Palestinians have been struggling in a nationalist struggle for a long time, and I think it's important to put right at the outset that it's not a religious conflict, right? Religion has deeply been entangled in it, but at its core, this is a nationalist conflict. It's two competing nations on one land, claiming one land, and the majority population of the land, the Arab population, has always felt that their right to self-determination has been sidelined and suppressed in favor of the other group's exclusive right to self-determination on the land. And this really goes back to British colonialism, because it was all made possible when the British took over the country in 1917. And so Britain controlled the country and governed the country, occupied the country for about 30 years. And during that time, the British colonial authorities kept the Arab nationalism at bay and facilitated Jewish nationalism, what's called Zionism. And a lot of that involved moving European Jews into the country. And the local population was vehemently, for the most part, opposed to this policy of the British favoring the Jewish national movement in the country, which in the year 1900, there was less than 10% of the country was Jewish. And by World War II, it had risen to about a third of the population was Jewish. And the majority of that growth was coming from European Jews coming to the country. And with the horrors of the of the Holocaust exposed after World War II, you had a massive global sympathy for this Jewish liberation movement, right? The urge to create a safe haven for the Jewish people after centuries of European persecution and one of the worst genocides in human history. The international community backed the Israeli claim, or the Zionist Jewish nationalist claim, and in the fighting that ensued, the majority of the Palestinian population was pushed off their land. Palestine, as the name, was removed from the map. Something like 400 or 500 towns and villages were wiped off the map, depopulated. And where did all the refugees go in 1948, when the majority of the Arab Palestinian population lost their homes? And they were pushed into Lebanon. There's refugees in Lebanon from 1948. There's refugees in Syria from 1948. They were pushed into what came to be called the West Bank. And they were pushed in what came to be called the Gaza Strip. So you had a big push of about 750,000 people at that time pushed from their homes and crucially not allowed to return. They were never allowed to return from the camps that they're in foreign countries, never allowed to return from the camps they're in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And so you see all sorts of resistance. Going back to the beginning, Palestinians employed very liberal sort of nationalist kind of protest, organizing congresses and demonstrations and trying to meet with and influence foreign dignitaries. But also insurgency and armed struggle became a major vein of Palestinian struggle. Armed guerrilla movements based from outside the country, attacking, trying to liberate Palestine in this sort of the decolonial, Marxist kind of nationalist model of revolutionary struggle. They never had a chance against Israel, and they were constantly beaten back and pushed further and further from their cause. And civil disobedience, nonviolent resistance, has been a major staple of Palestinian struggle from the beginning. Probably the very core of Palestinian struggle, which is something called samud, or steadfastness, holding steadfast to the land, just caring for that olive tree grove, just continuing to build and raise your family on the land against all kinds of pressures from the Israeli military, the state, the increasing settlers on the land trying to harass and push the Palestinians off their land. Just holding to the land is a kind of resistance, but also every textbook method of civil disobedience that you're aware of, forms of direct action, non-cooperation, so refusing to comply with military orders, resigning from offices related to the occupation, boycotting Israeli products and engaging in economic work strikes, withdrawing their labor power from the Israeli economy. And these sorts of struggle happened over years and years, and they ebb and they flow. But there's also been periods where the desperation has led to some to undertake, extreme acts of violence, like suicide bombing, what became a major Palestinian tactic in the 1990s and early 2000s. And since then, it's been very little armed struggle. Probably the main face of Palestinian armed struggle for the last 20 years has been in the form of these rockets that are these relatively low-tech rockets fired from the Gaza Strip as a way of armed struggle. And maybe some of the biggest, most inspiring, but also tragic cases of unarmed demonstration, unarmed protest, came in the Great March of Return in 2018, when Palestinian civil society, Palestinian political parties worked together to encourage the population to protest right to the gates, to march to the gates and demand the right to return to their lands. And the sniper fire, created thousands of amputees that are, in wheelchairs and missing limbs because they were shot down by snipers. Hundreds were shot and killed. And it sent, I think, a very dire message to the Palestinian people that even nonviolent, courageous nonviolent protest that involves incredible sacrifice is not going to get you anywhere. And one is just left with a constantly growing sense of pressure and desperation, I think, that leads to where we are now.
Darcy, I'll be loud. No, you keep it. Darcy, I was wondering, this idea of steadfastness and the kind of experiences of being displaced from your land and always having to peacefully resist despite the humiliations you endure or violence you endure. Does that resonate with you at all in the colonial experience in Canada?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And so we think about this, often we think about settler colonialism, right? And that shared seeds, I'm going to call this a diseased practice of settler colonialism, that we see. That's, people, it's resonating probably what Omar shared with people in the audience here. And when we think about that, colonization, the displacement of people, settler colonialism often, most of the time, includes Indigenous people, displacement of Indigenous folks. And really is rooted, right? So when you talk about these commonalities, is rooted in racism, in white supremacy. And so when you think about what I hear, even in that 1948 or even prior, what was the term used by Zionists?
Land without a people.
Land without a people, people without a land, right? That's the same roots that we see with the things that we think about here in North America, about the doctrine of discovery, about manifest destiny, that there's just these areas that we can come to and displace people because it's that it's that fervor, it's that spirit of these calls here, right? And so there's lots of commonalities there, right? And so when we think about steadfastness and we think about resisting settler coloniality, that's what we see in Indigenous nations here as well, right? And when you shared that, I was thinking of terms within our language that we talk about strength and our lands and how we keep it. And that's the one thing that is missing from the sort of settler colonial project is the understanding that, just as you were sharing even prior to this, that you're not going to move, right? And that's the same thing here. We see a lot of hardship that comes from there. And so I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about this question beforehand, and just how statehood actually provides this veneer for settler colonialism, right? And so we're seeing it today when you think about your question to the Western world, why aren't we doing anything? But we also see it in our governments, right? That inability to pierce the veneer of statehood. Because what statehood does, it allows governments domestically to use their laws for violent practices, for apartheid, right? And so another commonality we see within Canada here, we know that history for Indigenous folks here. But what it also does, it also has this buffer in an international community as well, right? There's this kind of like, not only, I'm not going to step on your toes here, but just this, almost like this prudent neighborliness that we're not going to overstep, right? And then in the most harshness, and what we're seeing now is allyship, right? And so when we know things are devastating, genocidal, that states people are afraid to speak up as well, right? And so that's sort of, been thinking quite a bit about that, about that effect of when it goes from peoplehood to statehood and the effect that has on enduring settler colonialism, right? And so we see those really stark, horrific, abhorrent things happening, but the day-to-day as well that we know occurred here, but is also occurring over there is just things like occupation of lands, permitting people to bulldoze houses. Every time there's a big event like this, it seems like there's a push to dispossess more lands, expropriation, right? And so when I talk about this sort of diseased practice, right, it's not to think about settler colonialism as like something we can name and be a standard, but it's really something that has a seed that really grows in diverse and grotesque ways around the world, right? And that's what we're seeing here. And so that's why you see a lot of Indigenous folks in North America taking up this solidarity, because we know those roots as well. Yeah.
You mentioned apartheid. This is how I will go into the next question. But UN Resolution 2625 affirms the legitimacy of the struggle of peoples for independence, territorial integrity, national unity, and liberation from colonial domination, apartheid, and foreign occupation by all available means. I'm wondering, as Israel justifies its siege on the occupied territories through self-defense, can that be permitted under international law when there is a right for self-determination of these people?
Yeah, this is a tricky question. I mean, it's not a tricky question legally. It's
complicated
a
issue.
Relatively straightforward question. I don't want to buy into that discourse. It's complicated. We shouldn't do anything about it. So let me explain how self-defense is supposed to operate. So going back to this point about states, right? States have, not peoples, not individuals, not communities, not groups. States have a right to self-defense under international law. They can respond to an armed attack and exercise their right to self-defense. That's the rule. And so when Hamas militants cross into Israeli-held territory or Israeli territory and attack there, kill 1,400 people, kill 1,000 civilians, the international community agrees that's an armed attack, which means now you can exercise the right to self-defense. It's important to always understand, though, that the right to self-defense is limited in a couple of ways. And you've probably heard a lot about this, so I apologize if I'm repeating things that you've already known. But let me bring them up anyway. So one thing you've probably heard about is that even if you're justified in going to war, that is, you're legitimately exercising the right to self-defense, you actually have the right to self-defense. It doesn't mean your right to respond is unlimited, right? You have to still conduct yourselves in accordance with the laws of war. And you've seen the very many ways in which the actions of the Israeli military have been described as violating or potentially violating the laws of war. So that's one piece of this, right? There's certain things you cannot do. There's certain things you have to keep in mind when you are exercising your right to self-defense. Your attacks have to be proportional is the word that's often used. And so we talk about 1,400 Israelis who are killed. We talk about 230 plus who are kidnapped. But part of the response we have to talk about is 10,000 Gazans dead, 4,000 of them being children, over 26,000 already injured. That in itself is an indicator that the right to self-defense, if it exists in this case, is not being exercised in accordance with the laws of war. So that's one thing to always keep in mind there. But there's a prior question to this, and that is whether the right to self-defense even allows what's happening right now. So some states say that, yes, Israel has the right to self-defense in this context. Others say, if you're an occupying power, and I can explain why Israel is still considered an occupying power in Gaza, even though the troops aren't on the ground, but if you're an occupying power, you can't claim self-defense in respect of an attack that comes from the place you're occupying. Others have said you can't claim self-defense against a non-state actor, and Hamas is not seen to be a state actor. There's no legally Palestinian state internationally. But even if we put those debates to one side and say that the right to self-defense was triggered, you still have to keep in mind what you're allowed to do in terms of actually exercising that right, broadly speaking. And even if your goal is legitimate under international law, that is to say, let's say it's legitimate to defeat Hamas totally as a military and political organization, which is what's been said recently. International law says, even if the goal is legitimate, if the collateral damage, right, that's another phrase that's used often, if the collateral damage to human life, civilian life, is so great, your legitimate legal aims cannot be undertaken. You have to stop what you are doing. You've pushed them back into the Gaza Strip. If in order to actually eliminate them, you have to kill this many civilians as well, then your right to self-defense ends at that point. And what you need to do at that point is not continue the conflict in that way, but to engage in a ceasefire. So the law of self-defense actually pushes us in a particular direction, even if it's triggered in this case. It pushes us in a particular direction, which is towards the end of this conflict, at least in the way that it's being conducted right now. And of course, that places obligation on Hamas with respect to the hostages they've taken as well, but it places obligations on Israel as well. So the law of self-defense, if it exists in this case, still places important limits on what can be done legally.
But in this specific case, does it exist according to international law? And that's just a question.
It's a really good question.
It's fine, we can take the recording off. If
No, I can tell you how it's debated, right? So at the UN Security Council right now, it's been debated in three ways. You have some states who say, yes, the right to self-defense exists. There's no question about that.
an occupying power has the right to exist, to resist, to self-defense in this case, according to international law?
So international law has no clear question, no answer on this, and that's part of the problem. There's no clarity about this point. So in the past, the International Court of Justice says the wall that was built inside of the West Bank, or partly inside of the West Bank, inside of the Green Line, that could be seen as an act of self-defense, except that this is attacks coming from occupied territory that they're trying to ward off, and therefore you can't build that wall. Other states disagree. The United States disagrees. The United States says you can exercise self-defense against non-state actors in foreign states. They don't have to exist. You can do that. And that's how, in part, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are justified. There are other states who are very clear. Jordan is one of them. Pakistan is one of them. And they say if you're occupying a territory, you have no right to self-defense. You can't claim self-defense. And there are other states who say that you can't claim self-defense if it's not a state. So this is part of the debate that's happening. If you read the UN Security Council resolutions, you will see that some states are pushing for statements that Israel has the inherent right to self-defense, and others are pushing back because they disagree with that, mainly because they think occupying powers cannot claim the right to self-defense. But international law, this is one of the joys of international law, doesn't give you a clear answer on this question. But the other part about self-defense that I was talking about in terms of the limits placed on it, that's why I went to that point. It gives us a much clearer answer on when and where and how you have to end that conflict.
Kiani, I also, before you hand off, I also was hoping you could kind of expand on that idea that Israel is an occupying state in the first place. Because this is another issue that tends to be contested by Western powers. So I think it's important to just elucidate that, yeah, in fact, it is likely an occupying state under law.
Here's one of those other areas where the law could be clearer.
Mm-hmm.
Let me try and offer you the argument, right? So traditionally, the way in which you know that a territory is being occupied is because there are foreign troops that are there. The local government cannot act as a government. The foreign troops have the capacity to act as the government. This is what's called effective control. And the local people do not want that foreign authority there. That's the classic definition of international law's sense of occupation. So the troops have to be there. And until 2005, between 1967 and 2005, it was very clear that Gaza was occupied because the Israeli troops and settlers were on the ground there. Here's another euphemism. After the disengagement, right? You disengage, the wall is still there, the troops are still there, you control everything going on, you disengaged, okay? After the disengagement, the question became, if the troops aren't on the ground, how can you still call it an occupation? Calling it an occupation matters, because if it's an occupation, the occupier has specific legal obligations. Some of these are things like the duty to not conscript locals, the duty to not destroy property, personal or real property, but also the duty to facilitate, to the fullest extent possible, that's the language from the Geneva Conventions, necessary food and medical supplies. The duty to facilitate, to the fullest extent possible, public health and hygiene. And if you are unable to facilitate those duties, to satisfy those duties, then the obligation to facilitate humanitarian relief from some third party. Occupiers have those positive obligations. So it actually matters materially if they're occupiers or not. So the argument against seeing Israel as an occupying power is that they are no longer there. The argument in favor of seeing Israel as an occupying power is that Israel has a total blockade on the Gaza Strip in terms of being able to control who goes in and out at 6 of the crossings into Gaza, having a blockade navally completely, controlling the airspace around Gaza, being able to regularly go in. This is the 6th war since the disengagement that's been fought inside of Gaza. Being able to regularly go in and being able to reassert some kind of authority in a relatively short amount of time. Now, the lawyers will disagree. How short does it have to be? But this is some of the evidence in favor of that. Israel also has this buffer zone that Omar mentioned earlier. So a zone inside of Gaza that at times has been up to 1.5 kilometers deep from the fence, from the wall, in which if you go in, you will be shot by automated weapon systems. Or alternatively, you will encounter Israeli troops patrolling that area. So here the troops are on the ground again. They have complete control of the Palestinian population registry. So this is who is defined as a Palestinian, and therefore who is allowed to live in Gaza. They also control that. And they also collect taxes here as well. And the dominant Israeli currency, you can correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand in the Gaza Strip, is still the Israeli shekel. All the goods that are going in, they can turn the power off, they can turn the electricity off, they can control access to food. Whatever government exists within Gaza is dependent on Israeli cooperation in order to function as a government. And that's the argument in favor of saying there's still an occupying power, at least in part, in some very important ways, and in the ways that really matter. That is controlling the life-saving food, medicine, and water that's needed. There's an argument that even when they were occupying, they violated these rules. You mentioned the calorie counting, right? The calorie counting is not a part of the occupier's obligation. It's beyond that. It's above that. But that's how this it's understood as a continuing occupation, because of this complete control, this long-standing history, the ability to go in, the fact of often being there anyway on the ground, that's how it's still understood as an occupation.
Could I just follow up on that? To be clear, the ambiguity, such as it is regarding this occupied status or not of the Gaza Strip, it doesn't apply to the West Bank or to East Jerusalem, where there is a broad international consensus, not ambiguous, that they are occupied territories. And the same applied to Gaza, at least up until the 2005 disengagement, and according to many, still to this day. So we're talking about the official foreign policy of basically all the Western governments in the world, including Canada, including the US. If you look at their foreign policy statements on the Israel-Palestine situation, the West Bank is occupied Palestinian territory. East Jerusalem is occupied Palestinian territory. And according to the UN General Assembly, by votes of the overwhelming majority, occupied territory. And this goes as high as the supreme authority in the international system, the Security Council, which has been issuing resolutions since the 1960s. And you know, when the Security Council agrees on something and passes it, it exhibits a degree of consensus. And the Security Council, as recently as 2016, in President Obama's waning days, reiterated that the settlements in the West Bank, the settlements in East Jerusalem are illegal under international law because they're on occupied territory. So there is no ambiguity, except if you ask the politicians of Israel's most vocal supporters as to whether or not that's a disputed claim.
Thank you. On this topic, I promise we'll get on that topic. Right now, the recently resigned former UN Human Rights New York Office Director Craig Mochaberg, who recently resigned in protest over the UN's failure to intervene in Gaza and the West Bank, has stated that the actions taken by Israel constitute a fairly clear case of genocide. He's quoted by Al Jazeera saying, "Usually the most difficult part of proving genocide is intent, because there has to be an intention to destroy in whole or in part a particular group. In this case, the intent by Israeli leaders has been so explicitly stated and publicly stated by the Prime Minister, by the President, by senior cabinet ministers, by military leaders, that this is an easy case to make, and it's on the public record." I'll first go to Kiani again. I'm so sorry. To elucidate kind of this statement. What are the elements of genocide? How is intent proven in international law?
Thank you. We live in an era of open letters, right? Open letters about hiring law students or not hiring them. Open letters about environmental disasters, about genocide now. And I've had come across two in relation to this exact question recently. One signed by 100 lawyers and professors who say that Hamas's actions constituted genocide. And then another signed by close to 900 lawyers saying that Israel's actions are possibly genocide. Right? So here we have 1,000 lawyers saying that there's genocide happening. And maybe one of the scariest things is that these aren't mutually exclusive options, right? So if this is all what's being said and what's happening here, we should probably figure out what the law of genocide is. Genocide is not a distinct action in and of itself. Genocide is any one of a range of actions. That is, killing members of the group. A group. What kind of group? A group defined defined as either on national lines, on racial lines, on ethnic lines, or on religious lines. Right? So a racial, national, ethnic, or religious group. Attempting to destroy them in whole or in part by killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Those last two, about forcibly transferring children and imposing measures intended to prevent births, I won't talk about here. I think the other three are mainly relevant in this conflict. So any of those actions taken with the intent to destroy in whole or in part this particular group could constitute genocide. And so the argument is that Hamas attacked Israelis because they are Israelis. They destroyed entire communities, and that makes it genocide. And the response is that, not the response, the argument that Israel is committing genocide is the actions themselves of bombarding Gaza. And it was something like 6,000 bombs in the first week. Peak levels of American bombing in all of Afghanistan in 1 year. They did that in 1 week in this incredibly densely populated area, 365 square kilometers. That induced so much, again, collateral damage, that you had to know what the consequences of this were if you didn't actually intend them. So what Craig Mokaber is saying is that you don't even have to make that inference at this point. What he's saying is that it goes from ordinary war crimes or crimes against humanity to genocide, because you can see how Israeli military and political leaders are describing what they're doing. And I'm sure we can talk more about what the language around that is, but there's many statements in that vein. But what makes genocide genocide is that demonstrated intent. And often it's hard to do. But in this case, what he's saying is that there's so much out there that it's very easy to do. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in with examples of that. I have many, but you may have others. Right. Okay. The Israeli defense minister on the 9th of October said, I think, talking specifically about Hamas, we are fighting human animals and we act accordingly. But then on a tour of Israeli soldiers on a tour of southern Israel, speaking to Israeli soldiers, he says, we're moving to a full-scale response. We're removing every restriction on the Israeli forces. Gaza won't return to what it was before. We will eliminate everything. The next day, picking up the language of animals, the head of the Israeli army's coordinator of government activities in the territories, note that it doesn't say occupied territories, but the territories, addresses a message to Gaza residents, says, human animals must be treated as such. There will be no electricity and no water. There will be only destruction. You wanted hell, you will get hell. The same day, Israeli army spokesperson Daniel Hagari says the emphasis, in terms of Israel's bombing campaign, he says the emphasis is on damage and not on accuracy. Those are the military people involved. Israel's president says it's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true, this rhetoric about civilians not being aware, not involved, is absolutely not true. The Minister of Energy and Infrastructure said, no electrical switch will be turned on, no water hydrant will be opened, and no fuel truck will enter until the Israeli abductees are returned home. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says this sounds like collective punishment, this is all happening, a debate happening on X, on Twitter. He said, indeed, Madam Congresswoman, all the civilian population in Gaza is ordered to leave immediately. We will win. They will not receive a drop of water or a single battery until they leave the world. So here you see, do you want to add to this, please?
The Minister of Culture and Heritage just said yesterday that the minimum we should do, and I'm not quoting exactly here, but what he said is he wants to send a nuclear bomb to the Gaza Strip. That was officially in the media and officially on X as well. Now you're denying it. I'll bring it to you.
So one of the challenges here is often figuring out how the things that are being said are related to what's actually happening on the ground. And that's why there's often a focus on military and political leaders, people involved in decision-making and setting policy for how these things are conducted. And that's why I focused initially on these military leaders, and then again on these political leaders, what they've said here. You can see how that language seems to parallel the first three forms of committing genocide that I spoke about. Deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to cause destruction in whole or in part of the group. This goes back to the question of, is the electricity on so the water pumps can run? Is the fuel going in? Are the supplies being let in? Is the food being let in? Those kinds of questions. Right? And then the other stuff, I think, is more straightforward in terms of the actual physical harm that's being done here, resulting in both, as I said, thousands of deaths as well as tens of thousands now of wounded. Right? So that's the legal argument here, right? And that's how the connections are being drawn between those political and military leaders and then the actual military policy or military actions that are being conducted.
Darcy, I'm going to direct this one to you. Omar, do you have something to say?
No,
okay.
I'm just passing it.
Professor Lindberg, these legal definitions of genocide, as Kiani has taught us in his international law class, they have been constructed in particular ways to limit the ways that genocide can be applied. In the Canadian context, how has the definition of genocide been limited? And what responsibilities does the Canadian state have to address genocide both domestically and internationally?
Yeah, great question. You hit a lot of hypotheticals, I'm sorry. So thinking about this, we know at the creation of the convention that thinks about genocide, that cultural genocide was left off, often described at the behest of Canadian officials because of what was occurring when you think about 1948 to 1951, the residential school era here as well, and that sort of definition Canada would fit in there. And so just thinking about who is naming things, making terms, doing that lawyering we see back in the day that is setting outside. And so much of what I hear you talking about is this working around the term genocide through actions, right? And it's almost like this complicitness with lawyers figuring out giving advice, right, on what a state can do without crossing that line as well, right? And so we've seen that in the history, and we also see it with its implications in Canada today. When I talk about like settler colonialism and its roots grow in different ways, it's not to say everything is equal in the treatment of Indigenous folks here and other places, but it grows in other ways. But we think about it here, we even saw it with the murder of missing Indigenous women and girls, that inquiry that talked about genocide, right? And that sort of, when it came out, the discussion in the media was, is this genocide or not, right? And so there is this point of these terms when they become, and I use this very loosely, a legal term of art, like genocide, and we're having the debates here. It's really distracting from the humanitarian conflicts that are going on, obviously right now, here, and in those as well, right? And so when you think about, I hear what you're sharing, and I think about, we're discussing whether it fits there or not, right? But also on the ground there. I often think if we get close to even talking about genocide, we're in deep trouble. Someone's in deep trouble somewhere as well, right? And we could think about there. So it's vitally important, the term, and figuring it out in terms of justice, what occurs afterwards. But even that we're in the realm there, it's a really difficult part we're in society, right? And so I often think about this as in my notes here, and I'm like, do I say this or not? It's just like, there's this thing about lawyering that just makes people morally complicit sometimes when we're figuring out, is this crossing that deep ethical line there? And what advice we're giving if that's what's occurring here. And when we start to think about these things in this term, we're starting to bereave humans of their moral compass when we're just thinking about the strict definition, right? And so my caution in that question often is like, yes, that we got to take that tool back, right, of thinking about language in there. And it becomes something that's important after the fact, but also if we're talking about it, we're in really significant, dangerous times.
Can I add one thing about the Canadian context?
Go ahead.
Just one quick thing about the Canadian context as well. So, yes, the Canadian lawyers were sent to the Genocide Convention and they were told, if it includes cultural genocide, we're not signing it. Do whatever you have to do to make sure it doesn't include that. But then when Canada domesticated the law about genocide, they even narrowed the definition further in the Criminal Code and the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act. And right now, Canada reserves the right to prosecute people for international crimes committed overseas, no matter when they were committed. But if the crimes occurred within this territory, they cannot be prosecuted unless they occurred after the year 2000. Right? So that's another way in which this discrepancy manifests itself in the statute and the law.
I have a question. So we do remember when our Prime Minister called that the illegal Russian occupation on the Ukrainian land officially on a news press as a genocide. Does that make also what's happening against Palestinians, considering the numbers of people who are killed in 26 days are the equivalent of numbers of civilians who are killed in Ukraine until now, even more? Does that make the Canadian government complicit to saying that this is a genocide, especially if it was the Prime Minister who called it from day one a genocide? Or does that put the Canadian government in any kind of ethical or moral compass to say that we took that scenario as a genocide, but we're not taking this as a genocide, or they should, or they shouldn't? What do you think?
When states decide to call something genocide, they're very reluctant to do it. And the reason they're reluctant to do it is because the Genocide Convention says every state that ratifies this convention, that agrees to it, has a duty to prevent or punish genocide. So the United States didn't want to call what was happening in Darfur genocide for many years because they thought if we say that, then we have to go do something about it. So oftentimes the decision to call something genocide or not calling genocide has nothing to do with the facts on the ground. It has everything to do with the obligations that are placed on the person saying this is genocide. Right? And if you don't want those obligations, you will say it's not. I think that probably explains what's happening here.
I have a follow-up on that one. So the obligation to prevent genocide only comes into play once you call something genocide?
No. It doesn't come in. That's not the only time it comes into play, but that's what states are worried about, that if we say it is genocide, then we will have determined that it is genocide, and then we have to do something about it.
Right.
They wait for the courts to make decisions otherwise, right? But if they come out and say it themselves, then they have placed the obligations on themselves to do something about it.
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to power at the end of the day. International law as a function of power. And that's obviously not just how international law functions, but I guess what do resolutions on ceasefires from the UN National Assembly mean when the U.S. is funding Israeli weapons and funding this ongoing genocide, and the Canadian state is funding this ongoing genocide? The most powerful nations are in support of Israel. What does international law mean then? And I guess that's a question I have for everyone, is how can we make international law matter? Can people make international law matter? Can movements move states? I think right now we're all feeling hopeless in the face of popular support for Palestine, popular support to say there needs to be a ceasefire, but states don't listen and states don't care, even though a vast majority of us are calling for them to listen. Hundreds of thousands are protesting. How can we make states comply with international law, respect the sanctity of human life? How can we move states, I guess, is my question. And that's a question for everyone. Big question.
I do think that popular power, people power, popular movements is probably the best form of power that we have. It's no guarantee, it's no silver bullet. And maybe just to throw another concept into the mix is not so much the international law around, but the international norm around responsibility to protect. This RtoP doctrine, the Canada was instrumental in crafting and shaping around 20 years ago, has been endorsed by the UN, this notion that states have a responsibility to protect the populations that they control. And if they fail in that responsibility to protect, either because they're unwilling or unable, then the international community may step in and may indeed take up that responsibility. And in the process, so I'm curious what happened to this new norm of responsibility to protect that has been very popular over the last several years and a couple of decades, and wondering if that applies and how so, and if there may be some traction as a sort of communicative, tactical approach of movements or activists to adopt that language. But I don't mean to abandon the discussion of genocide, but just add that to the mix.
Thanks. RtoP, where did it go? It went two places. One, it was exhausted by the US and UK when they finished with Iraq and Afghanistan. And then the Russians said we need to protect Russians in Ukraine and Crimea. That's basically where it's fallen to now. There's been a real shift in terms of how collective military action takes place, collective intervention takes place these days. It's much more focused in military alliances as opposed to through the UN. And there's been legitimate criticism to the responsibility to protect as well, in part because of what the US and UK did in Iraq and Afghanistan for so many years. So I think that's part of why it's fallen into disuse. But I also don't think it was ever designed to be used in this situation, in a scenario where the most powerful military states in the world are allied with, or see themselves as allied with, the person or the state against whom you would feel like you have to intervene, right? And I think that's, even if it was still an active doctrine, I don't think it was ever active in that way.
Answering your question, if you remember the first couple weeks, we've been hearing the numbers going every day. 300 people are killed in Palestine in the Gaza Strip. There was a day where there was 700 people. Remember when they bombed Jabalia refugee camp? By the way, Jabalia refugee camp is 1 kilometer square. You can bike the square in 10 minutes, 5 minutes, even less, right? It's a 1 kilometer square.
And they bombed it 3 times.
And they bombed it 3 times. And you know what they bombed it with? With the F-35, with that missile is 1-ton missile. And what was the reason? Is that they suspected that there is a Hamas leader around people. 700 people died as a collateral damage. But now, because we've seen people, 250,000 people are marching in DC, 350,000 people are marching in London, in Berlin, even with all the regulations that the government put of raising a Palestinian flag would actually get fined. 150 people were marching. Now we're seeing that the language of the Western media is not only changing, but we're also every single day, because I count the numbers of people who are died every day, and I see that their faces, trying to see if they are my brother or not, or a relative or not on TV. The numbers are now, we're talking about 30 a day, 40 a day. We went from 700 when the whole world was quiet into 30. Still, one person is a big loss. So this brings us to the idea that when those governments sees that the free people and all these movements, peaceful movements, are actually making not only an echo, but making a big noise. Now MPs are signing papers saying we want ceasefire. I know MPs who didn't even answer my phone call in the beginning of the whole escalation. Now they're calling me back saying, actually, I signed a letter. You know why? Because they saw people going in the streets, because they know that there is something called democracy in the Western world. I mean, democracy. But at the same time, they know that people are not going to vote for this person. So this brings us back to the free people. Canada has the most educated nation in the world per capita. Wonderful. Why are we only seeing 100,000 people in Toronto marching? Really? Why are we only seeing 50,000 people in Vancouver? There must be more people. We're seeing more people in the UK. 350,000 people are marching in London. Now, someone like Sunak is absolutely changing his language because he knows he's not going to get elected. So back to the power of people. It doesn't matter what the hell is the international law is saying, because they can tailor it the way they want. But we can see the stuff on the grounds. We are seeing now CBC is calling me to cover my family story. You know what? 3 weeks ago, I called every single one of them. They didn't want to talk to me.
The whole airtime was only talking about the family and the civilians and the family and relatives of Canadians who lost people in Israel. And that's fine. I'm not asking people not to cover a story, but at least to be equal in giving an airtime. Now they're coming back giving us 20%, 10% of airtime. It's okay, but with more echo, more noise, they are going to cover our stories more.
Wrap up the questions. I just want to echo this call to action. UVic, our students are organizing, they're holding events, they're scheduling walkouts for November 9th, which the PYM has called on us. Let's make noise. Let's keep this momentum going, and the organizers will be sending out emails with petitions, letters, calls to action, and upcoming events that you all should participate in, and we will too. And be courageous. Speak for the Palestinians.
You know, even if you don't have the power to go and march, and I understand it, everyone is busy. I work in a corporate world. I'm a corporate slave, 9 to 5. It's fine. But you know, the minimum that you can do is do a TikTok. I mean, I can't say thanks to the Chinese for opening TikTok and uncensoring it. I don't know what to say. But at least now X, which is called Twitter, is now open. You know, I monitor, I work in data as an IT person, and I see the data of people actually talking about Palestine and hashtags. That the change is massive. Again, and I'm not being racist here or something. For someone like me, a brown dude, Palestinian immigrant becoming a Canadian citizen, I want to tell you something. My voice is not equivalent as someone who is a white Canadian voice. Let's be clear. So what we're asking for here is use your privilege. We all know that you have it. Use it as much as you can with advocating on behalf of our people who are dying for no freaking damn reason. If it's not marching in the streets, if it's not writing a letter to your MP, at least do one video on TikTok, on Facebook, but it's censored. X, try to talk to someone, anyone you have. I can't really imagine someone seeing what's happening in TV and being able to go to bed like nothing and just have a nice joint and forget about it. It doesn't work like that. 2 joints are not going to fix it. You need to do something about this.
Thank you.